Did you know that the Vikings, known for their bravery and ferocity, hid an even darker side that is rarely mentioned in history books? Behind their conquests and legends, they practiced torture so inhuman and cruel that, for centuries, they were hidden and forbidden to be told. In this video, we're going to unearth those horrors, one by one, revealing the most horrifying techniques that spread terror across Europe. But beware, some of these practices are so brutal that they will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Vikings. And I assure you, by the end of this video, you will discover the most atrocious and disturbing of them all. You won't want to miss it. Leave me a comment telling me which of these tortures you found the most inhuman. And if you know of any others that we didn't mention, share them. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more dark stories like this one. Are you ready? Then let's begin this journey into the darkest side of Viking history, blinding with hot iron, the punishment that stole the light forever. Among the most brutal and ruthless methods used by the Vikings against their enemies, there stands out a practice that not only sought to inflict indescribable pain, but also eternal humiliation, blinding with red-hot iron. This torture did not kill immediately, but it did take away what many consider their most valuable treasure, their sight. Imagine for a moment being on your knees, a prisoner, knowing that they won't execute you quickly. No, instead, they heat a bar of iron or a sword until it glows red-hot, while the Viking warriors chant ritual songs or shout with excitement. The metal burns, crackling, illuminating the terrified face of the victim, until finally, without any mercy, they slowly bring it closer to the open eyes, forcing the person to look at the very iron that, in seconds, will melt their eyeballs. The pain is immediate, excruciating, and the smell of burning flesh fills the air. The victim screams, writhes, but they are tightly bound, powerless before their fate. Unlike other methods of quick execution, this torture allowed the person to stay alive, but destroyed, blind, and disfigured forever. The Vikings, though commonly portrayed as honorable warriors, in certain circumstances used these techniques as a warning. This is what awaits those who dare betray a Viking. Often, this brutality was reserved for traitors, spies, or enemies they considered especially despicable. Beyond the unbearable physical pain, there was also a devastating psychological component. At that time, losing sight meant being condemned to a life of complete dependence or to a slow death by starvation, without the ability to defend oneself or hunt. The blind prisoner became a vulnerable being, completely at the mercy of others. Some ancient accounts, passed down from generation to generation, claim that victims of this torture wandered through forests or villages disoriented until they eventually perished. Others mention that the Vikings deliberately left them alive, as a macabre reminder to those who dare to face them. The most disturbing part of all is that this practice was kept secret within certain clans, as exclusive knowledge applied only in exceptional cases. It wasn't something the Vikings openly talked about, because they knew that the cruelty of this punishment exceeded the limits of humanity accepted even in their own time. Can you imagine a horror of facing not death, but life without light, with the indelible marks of burning iron as an eternal scar? Leave me a comment. Do you think this kind of torture is worse than a quick death? What do you think your reaction would be if faced with such a fate? And don't go anywhere, because what comes next is even more shocking. The next Viking method surpasses everything we've told so far. Don't miss it. Imprisonment in floating prisons, the most desperate fate on the infinite sea. Among all the forms of torture and punishment practiced by the Vikings, there's one that is less known, but possibly one of the most desperate and terrifying. Imprisonment in floating prisons. Imagine being captured by a band of fierce Viking warriors. Instead of executing you immediately or subjecting you to physical torture, they tightly bind your hands and feet, place you in a small vessel, barely a rudimentary raft or a flimsy boat, and push you out into the open sea. No oars, no sails, just you, the waves, and the vastness of the ocean. At first, the sensation of freedom may seem deceptive. The salty air, the endless horizon, but within hours, reality sets in. You are completely alone, with no direction, no drinking water, exposed to the elements. The torture is not immediate. It is slow, agonizing, and attacks both body and mind. The sun punishes the skin mercilessly, dehydrating the prisoner until the lips crack, the tongue swells, and thirst becomes an unbearable torment. At night, the cold seeps into the bones, while a howling wind and the creaking of warren would feed the worst fears. But the worst part is the loneliness. Many prisoners, before succumbing to starvation or exposure, lost their sanity. There are accounts describing how the condemned would start to scream desperately, converse with imaginary voices, or even throw themselves into the water in a last attempt to escape that prison without walls. This practice was not only used as punishment, it was also a brutal warning to peoples who dare resist Viking dominance. Some clans would leave the vessels adrift near enemy shores, so that the inhabitants could see, from the coastline, the fate that awaited them if they dared to fight back. The macabre aspect of this method is that it did not spill blood, but it condemned the victim to a sure, painful, and slow death. Unlike more direct tortures, here nature was the executioner. Hunger, thirst, exposure, and even marine predators. These floating prisons became a perfect metaphor for Viking power, relentless, calculating, and ruthless. They didn't need to wield a sword to destroy their enemies. It was enough to abandon them to their fate on the immense and untamable sea. Can you imagine the desperation of seeing the horizon in every direction and knowing that you will never reach solid ground? Leave your response in the comments. Do you think this torture is worse than a quick execution? What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a situation like this? And stay until the end, because the next torture we will reveal is even more horrifying and was considered the most inhumane of all by the Vikings themselves. You don't want to miss it. Impaling on wooden stakes, the cruelest and most painful torture the Vikings impose on their enemies. Of all the forms of punishment the Vikings could inflict, impaling on wooden stakes stands out as one of the cruelest, slowest, and most painful. This method did not merely aim to eliminate the enemy physically, but it had an even darker purpose: to break their spirit and send an indelible warning to all who dare to challenge Viking power. The procedure was as horrifying as it was meticulous. First, prisoners were stripped naked and their bodies immobilized with thick ropes, bound hand and foot so they could not resist. Then, the Viking warriors would sharpen large wooden stakes, hardened by fire, so they could slowly penetrate the flesh. These stakes were firmly driven into the ground while the condemned were hoisted and impaled alive upon them. The technique varied depending on the executioner's intent. Sometimes, the stake would be inserted to the lower torso and exit through the shoulder or collarbone, avoiding vital organs to prolong the agony for hours or even days. In the most extreme cases, the stake would be inserted vertically, piercing the body from below and exiting to the mouth or chest, a death that, though inevitable, did not occur immediately. The victim's anguished screams would echo through the forests or along the shores where the Vikings conducted these public executions. But for the Vikings, this was not just a show of force. It was a ceremonial warning, a ritual of domination that made it clear that no one could challenge their supremacy without suffering the most atrocious consequences. The stakes, with the impaled bodies, were left in plain sight. The corpses would decompose slowly, attracting scavengers and spreading a foul stench that would linger in the area for weeks. In this way, the terror multiplied. It was not just death, but the spectacle of death that left a lasting impression on survivors. This method had a devastating psychological component. Those who witnessed it knew that if they opposed the Vikings, they would not only lose their lives, but die in the most humiliating and painful way imaginable, turned into a living warning for their people. The practice of impalement transcended generations, and although historical records about the Vikings often highlight their skills as traders, navigators, and explorers, it is impossible to ignore the ferocity with which they treated their enemies on the battlefield and at the execution ground. Can you imagine what went through a person's mind as they were impaled, feeling it would slowly tear through their entrails, powerless to stop it? I invite you to share your opinion in the comments. Do you think this torture surpasses in brutality the ones we've seen so far? What do you think was the main purpose? Punishment or public humiliation? And don't go away, because in the next and final topic, we will reveal the most inhuman torture of all, one that even the Vikings themselves fear to speak aloud. Progressive dismemberment, the longest and most atrocious ritual of Viking pain. Among the most horrifying and meticulously designed tortures by the Vikings, progressive dismemberment holds a truly terrifying place. It wasn't simply a method of executing an enemy, but a spectacle of horror, a manifestation of absolute power that turned the human body into a stage of prolonged and excruciating suffering. The victim, usually a captured enemy or a traitor, was brought to a public place, in front of the entire village or clan, to serve as a cautionary example. The process began with complete immobilization, wrists and ankles bound tightly with rawhide cords, stretched until the skin began to tear. There was no chance of escape, no mercy. The goal wasn't immediate death, but a slow, physical, and psychological destruction. The Viking executioners, experts in anatomy thanks to years of war and hunting, carefully chose where to begin, usually with the fingers. Using sharp knives and small axes, they would start cutting off the fingers one by one, ensuring that the wounds were not instantly fatal, but deep enough to cause indescribable pain. The victim's screams would fill the air as a crowd, often made up of men, women, and children, watched with a mix of horror, respect, and in some cases, morbid fascination. Once the hands were rendered useless, they would continue with the feet and toes, increasing the suffering and further weakening the condemned. But the cruelest act came next. The executioners would slowly amputate the arms and legs, section by section. This was often done in multiple stages, giving the victim time to endure the loss of each part of their body before moving on to the next. Progressive dismemberment was a torture that could extend for hours, even days, depending on the victim's resilience and the patience of the executioners. In many cases, the torturers had strict orders not to allow the condemned to die until all limbs had been severed. Rudimentary techniques were applied to temporarily stop the bleeding, solely to prolong the agony. This type of execution did not only aim to cause physical pain, but to completely break the victim's will, destroying their humanity piece by piece. The suffering did not end with the loss of limbs. When the body was reduced to a bleeding torso, it would be left exposed to the elements, at the mercy of scavenging beasts or the freezing cold of the Nordic lands, until death finally claimed it. For the Vikings, this punishment served as a brutal warning. Treachery, cowardice, or opposition were paid for an appallingly high price. Not only would you lose your life, you would lose every part of your body, torn away with deliberate slowness before the eyes of all. It's important to emphasize that progressive dismemberment wasn't applied indiscriminately. It was reserved for those considered particularly dangerous enemies or traitors whose memory had to be erased in the most humiliating and painful way possible. Can you imagine the desperation of slowly watching your body being cut to pieces, with no possibility of defense or mercy? This method, so meticulously executed, reveals the rawness of Viking mentality and how torture was used not only as punishment, but as a tool of psychological and social domination. Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think this torture surpasses in brutality the others we've seen? How far can human being go when driven by the desire for revenge or power? And don't go away, because the next topics will reveal even more hidden horrors of Viking brutality. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any details of these shocking stories. The forest execution, the icy and savage punishment of the Vikings. Among the most terrifying and cruel forms of execution practiced by the Vikings, the infamous forest execution stands out, a method that combined the relentless power of nature with the sadistic cunning of human design. This practice not only ensured a slow and painful death, but turned the natural elements themselves into merciless executioners, a stage set for horror. It all began with the capture of the condemned, prisoners of war, traitors, or even those who dared defy the rigid norms of the clan. The ritual took place in the deep, dark northern forests, places where the density of the trees created an oppressive atmosphere and where the temperature would drop to lethal levels, especially during the winter months. The procedure was meticulously executed. The victim was partially or completely stripped, exposing their body to the freezing cold, thus accelerating the onset of hypothermia. Then they were tied with rustic, sturdy ropes to the trunks of trees, usually in a position that prevented any possibility of escape or movement. The bindings were so tight that, over the hours, the skin would begin to tear, adding another level of physical suffering. The torment of cold and solitude. Once the victim was secured, the Vikings would leave, abandoning the condemned alone in the middle of the forest. Here began the true punishment, the slow and merciless agony delivered by nature itself. During the first hours, the body would struggle to resist, violent shivering, rapid breathing, and a piercing pain in the extremities. But little by little, hypothermia would take over every cell. Fingers and toes would go numb, lips would turn blue, and skin would crack under frost. And if the cold wasn't enough of an executioner, the forest's wild animals would complete the sentence. Hungry wolves, brown bears, and scavenger birds lurked among the trees, drawn by the scent of blood and desperation. Some condemned individuals died of sheer terror just from hearing distant howls, while others were literally devoured alive, incapable of defending themselves or escaping. The forest execution was not a quick death. On the contrary, it could drag on for hours or even days. The condemned died slowly, whether by freezing, starvation, dehydration, or being torn apart by animals. And the most chilling part, all of it happened in the sepulchral silence of forest, with only the sounds of nature as witnesses to the horror, a message of terror and power. For the Vikings, this punishment held a deep symbolic meaning, allowing nature, powerful and untamable, to claim the life of the condemned. They didn't need to dirty their hands with direct executions. The earth, the cold, and the beasts fulfilled that role. It was also a forceful warning. If you defy our laws, nature will be your judge and your executioner. The memory of these executions spread quickly among villages and clans, sowing deep terror in anyone who dared to rebel. Curiously, some historical records and Norse sagas mention variants of this punishment, where the bodies of the executed were found months later, completely frozen or reduced to bones by predators, macabre monuments to Viking brutality. Can you imagine the desperation of hearing wolves approaching as your strength fades in the cold, with no chance of escape? This method reminds us that, in many ancient cultures, nature was not only a resource, but also a powerful tool of torture and execution. Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think this punishment is more cruel than direct executions? Could you have endured this agony if you had been in the victim's place? Don't go just yet. The next topics will reveal even more terrifying tortures that the Vikings prefer to keep secret. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss anything from this dark journey to the most brutal chapters of human history. The ice water torture, the silent agony beneath Viking ice. Of all the tortures and executions carried out by the Vikings, the ice water torture stands as one of the coldest, quietest, and most terrifying. Unlike more brutal and bloody methods, this technique was marked by the apparent calm of the environment, but it hid within it one of the slowest and most painful deaths a human being could experience. A frozen landscape turned into an instrument of death. The Vikings, known for their mastery of seafaring and maritime life, had an intimate relationship with water, but they also knew perfectly how to harness the destructive power of ice and cold in their punishments. The ice water torture was carried out mainly in the northern fjords, where the crystalline waters might seem serene, but concealed temperatures so low that, within minutes, they would paralyze muscles and plunge the mind into despair. The victim was taken to an improvised dock or a natural crack in the ice. Naked or lightly clothed, they were tied with thick ropes and slowly submerged in the icy waters, leaving only the head above the surface to prolong their suffering. In some cases, the Vikings would drill specific holes in the ice for this execution. The victim would be placed in one of them and tied, so they couldn't escape, while the cold penetrated to their very bones. The slow death, from shivering to eternal silence. The process was devastating. In the first minutes, the skin would turn an intense red, the teeth would chatter uncontrollably, and desperate screams would echo into the polar void. But quickly, the body would begin to lose control of its functions. Blood vessels constricted, internal organs slowed down, and the mind drifted into a state of absolute confusion. Some records from Norse sagas mention how Viking executioners, amid macabre laughter, would throw additional buckets of water over the victim or submerge them completely for brief moments to heighten panic and accelerate hypothermia. The victim, completely immobilized by numbness, would plead in vain as their body was consumed by the cold, inch by inch. The most terrifying aspect of this torture wasn't the immediate physical pain, but the long wait for death. In some cases, the condemned could remain in that state for several hours, as their consciousness slowly faded in a frozen and silent abyss. The symbolism of water, purification or condemnation. For the Vikings, water held a double meaning. It was a source of life, but also of destruction. This torture symbolized the purification of the traitor, who had to be cleansed of their sins in the coldest and deadliest waters of the world. But it also represented an irreversible condemnation. No one could defy the clan's laws and expect a swift death. The bodies, once deceased, were often left beneath the ice, becoming specters trapped in the depths of the fjords, or macabre warnings for those who might find the frozen remains in the spring, when the ice melted. A silence that anticipates the final horror. And so, while the condemned's last breath faded into the frozen air, the Viking executioners would withdraw, leaving nature to complete the work. The reflection of the moon on the icy waters was the only witness to the final agony, as the echo of the screams vanished into the vastness of the fjord. But, dear viewer, if you thought that the ice water torture was the cruelest method the Vikings could conceive, you are mistaken. Get ready, because what comes next is the most inhuman, savage, and terrifying method that has ever existed in Viking culture. A punishment so horrifying that even the most feared warriors preferred death in battle rather than face this fate. Don't go anywhere. Stay until the end, because what you'll discover next will leave you breathless. The Blood Eagle, the most cruel and iconic Viking torture. And now we've arrived at the pinnacle of horror, the torture that, even today, sends shivers down the spines of historians well accustomed to the violence of the past. A method so brutal that it was feared even by the fiercest Viking warriors. A punishment reserved only for the worst traitors and the most despicable enemies. Today, I will tell you in detail the story of the Blood Eagle, the most atrocious death ritual of Viking culture. The Blood Eagle, BLRN in Old Norse, was much more than a simple execution. It was a ritual of terror, a meticulously planned spectacle designed to instill fear, demonstrate power, and serve as a warning to anyone who dared to betray or challenge a Viking leader. First, the victim was captured and taken, usually, to a public place, a settlement square, a clearing in the forest, or the deck of a drakkar, Viking ship. There, surrounded by warriors and witnesses, the condemned was stripped completely naked and forced to kneel or lie face down. Then, the hell would begin. The process, an unimaginable agony. With sharp knives and axes, the executioner would make 2 long incisions along the back, from the base of the neck down to the lower back, cutting through skin, muscle, and finally breaking the ribs along the spine. This process turned the rib cage into a kind of open wings, hence the name, the Blood Eagle. But the most macabre part was yet to come. With surgical precision and amidst the victim's indescribable agony, who in some cases remained conscious, the executioner would extract the lungs and carefully spread them over the open ribs, creating the grotesque image of a pair of blood-soaked wings. All of this had to be done with utmost care, so that the victim would remain alive and conscious for as long as possible, suffering, seeing, and feeling how their body was being dismembered in such an inhuman way. The symbolism, betrayal punished with eternity. This method was not only meant to inflict pain, it also carried a profound symbolic meaning. The Blood Eagle represented that the victim, for their betrayal or crime, would never ascend to Valhalla, the paradise of Viking warriors. Their soul would be trapped, wandering, condemned to eternal suffering. Moreover, the image of the open wings, drenched in blood, and the vapor of still functioning lungs serve as a graphic warning to any spectator. This is how you'll end if you dare betray us. Myth or reality? To this day, historians debate whether the Blood Eagle was an actual historical practice or a legend amplified through Norse sagas. Some medieval texts, such as the Orkneyinga saga, describe in detail how this practice was supposedly carried out on historical figures like Aella of Northumbria, a king who was captured by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok and executed with this macabre method in revenge. Real or not, the mere telling of it has transcended the centuries as one of the most chilling symbols of Viking brutality. The silence after the horror. Imagine it. The executioner steps back, the witnesses fall silent, and only the destroyed body remains, its wings of flesh open to the cold Nordic wind, as blood mixes with the earth and legends are forged. The Blood Eagle was not just death. It was a spectacle, a warning, a display of Viking power taken to its darkest and most visceral extreme. The end, but not for you. And so, dear viewer, we've reached the end of this chilling journey through the most inhuman Viking tortures. But the journey doesn't end here. The knowledge of these practices reminds us how far human nature can go when power, honor, and revenge intertwine. If this video shocked you, leave me your comment. Do you think the blood eagle really existed? Would you dare to witness something like that? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more historical tales as dark and chilling as this one. And remember, this is only the beginning. The darkest pages of history are still waiting to be told here on Dark Medieval Tales.